Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Andy Major, and I'm a staff person at the Syracuse Peace Council. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of CNY Working for a Just Peace in Palestine and Israel, which is the sponsoring project for today's event. CNY Working is coordinated by the Peace Council and involves folks from the Islamic Society of Central New York, the Methodist Task Force for Justice and Peace in Palestine, something like that, Syracuse Jews for Peace, and other folks from the community who are concerned about this very critical issue, an issue which not only is very important in its own right for the Palestinian people who have suffered 60-plus years of dispossession, human rights violations, etc., for the Israelis who continue to live without security, to live as oppressors in many cases, which is no good for any of us, but for the entire Middle East and the entire world, because this conflict really is at the core of many of the issues that trouble much of the world. Today we're here not for a happy or a celebratory occasion, but rather to mark the anniversary of the Nakba, the catastrophe. And we've got three speakers who will tell you much more about that than I can in a much more personal, connected to their family sort of way. But it's important to us. This is the second year that we've done this. And it's an anniversary which hadn't previously, to our knowledge, been marked here in central New York. And we think it's very important for people to understand the history of this conflict. It's not something which happened yesterday. It's not something which happened a few years ago. It's a history with roots that go back well over 100 years. And understanding that history is really important for us to move forward to create justice. The work of CNY Working is very much based on education as well as advocacy. We believe that the United States government plays a very counterproductive role in terms of seeking justice and peace. And as U.S. citizens or as people who live in the United States, we think it's our role to change that, to change our government policies. So we're delighted to have you all here joining us. We may need a few more chairs, so I don't know if there's some folks in the back who could help grab a few more chairs out. So we'll have the three speakers. Then we'll have a kind of reception. There's going to be a bunch of food. There's traditional clothing for you to check out. There's a table with literature, some books for sale, sign up to get involved, buttons, bumper stickers, all those great activist kind of pieces. So before the first speaker, we've had a little change. Naja Zaid, who was part of the planning committee, along with myself and Pat Carmelli, who have been talking about this and working to make it happen for a number of months now. Naja had another commitment, so she's going to be late, so she'll read her poem later. But Ed Kanan, who's another member of the project overall, is going to come and share a message that he received from a Palestinian activist.
Thanks, Andy. Good afternoon, everyone. Sure glad to see you all here. This morning, we got a message from Mazen Kumsiya, who maybe many of you know, who is a Palestinian activist now in Bethlehem, and formerly, he taught at Yale. He's done a lot of speaking around the U.S., and his message has to do with the Nakba. And after I read that brief message, I'd like to read another dispatch, which we got later, about what has happened to Mazen in the last few hours. Okay, this was sent out on this morning. Sunday will be a significant day around the world as we not only commemorate, but this time act to end the Nakba that started 63 years ago. You can choose to wait it out, or you can go out into the streets and be the change you want to see in this world. I personally will be at the El Walaja in the Bethlehem district, where we gather at 10 a.m. at Ain Jaweza Mosque and march at 11 a.m. from the part of El Walaja, occupied in 1967, to the part occupied and ethnically cleansed in 1948. Others will be at the Quilandria checkpoint, 11 a.m., and then Ofer checkpoint at 2 p.m. near Ramallah. Thousands will march on the Lebanese-Palestinian border from both sides. Same for Egypt and Jordan. Thousands will be in cities around the world marching on Israeli embassies and consulates, usually around noon to 2 p.m. 63 years of ethnic cleansing meant that most of our people are refugees or displaced people, over 7 million, and that we comprise the largest remaining refugee population on Earth. 30% of the world's refugees are Palestinians. Enough is enough. Thousands have already demonstrated in Egyptian cities and in cities around the world on Friday and Saturday. But it is also not enough to have rallies and speeches. Civil disobedience / civil resistance and other methods, for example, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, must be expanded. Okay, so that was Mazen's message this morning. And here is another message, another dispatch that we got later in the day. This is from his email, but it's signed by a person named Jess. Israeli soldiers arrested Mazen along with 2 other Palestinians early this afternoon, local time, May 15th, 2011, as he was participating in a peaceful, nonviolent, civil disobedient march toward the Green Line in El Wilaja. Many media were there, and his arrest was caught on tapes as he was just at the scene peacefully. He is currently being held at the Israeli military compound near Rachel's tomb. Elsewhere in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and Golan Heights, there were reports that dozens were wounded in many places, including more than 150 wounded at Qalandria checkpoint. Please complain to your government and demand them stop supporting the brutal Israeli apartheid regime. Please support and participate in the Nakba events around the world today and double the efforts of BDS, that's boycott, divestment, sanctions, on apartheid Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Mazen, and thank you the thousands of other Palestinians who continue to rise up, to raise their voices in opposition to the oppression they experience and to stand for justice. So last year when our group started talking about commemorating the Nakba, we thought that a really ideal way to do that would be to find some local Palestinian-Americans, people who live in our community, some of whom have lived here for decades, but whose families have roots in Palestine and were affected by what happened in 1948 and the years before and after that. Last year we did that, and again we've been able to do it this year. So we're delighted to have Ahmed El-Hindi, Shaw Dalal, and Dana Alwan speak with us this afternoon. We've asked each of them to speak for about 15 minutes, so we'll do that one by one, and then we'll have some time for question and answer and some discussion before we break for the reception. So the first speaker is Ahmed El-Hindi, who's the CEO, CFO of Filter Tech Company located here in Manlius. He's been active with the Syracuse Area Middle East Dialogue Group, as well as other community affairs, a graduate of Syracuse University. So please, Dr. El-Hindi.
I'm not as tall as you are. That's okay. When Magda asked me about talking to you people, I really didn't know what to say. However, I did come to the United States in 1947, so I did not witness the Nakba, which the situation in 1948. I came to this country in 1947 to study at Syracuse University, and of course, 1948 stripped my family of everything. All I could hear is what they have done or what they have witnessed or experienced only through hearsay. However, I was 19 years old when I came to this country. Now I'm 83, so most of my life I have been spending it in the United States of America. And I appreciate the United States, really, for sometimes I don't agree with their policies and so on, but all in all, the U.S. had educated me, nurtured me, where I have sons and grandchildren, and they're all doing very well. So from that point of view, I appreciate the United States. And when I speak as a Palestinian, I also have to remember that most of my life I spent it in the United States, and I witnessed sometimes the wrong policies. Well, I want to speak a little bit about when I was young, how we perceived the Jewish people who came into Palestine. There was really no animosity as such until after 1936, from what I know. We had Jewish people who were good doctors and good engineers and very productive people. As a matter of fact, I came from a village named Yazur, which was, I was in a farm community. And there was a school, an agricultural school that started during the Ottoman times. They call it Nater, just between, in our village closer to Jaffa and Tel Aviv. We communicated with these people, we dealt with them. My father and these people went visiting each other. And we learned from them and learned from us. They learned from us how to raise oranges. And so there was really no problem as such, except the problem began when the situation says, well, we want this land to be exclusively for the Jewish people. The exclusivity is the problem. It's nothing that the Jewish people lived in there or they were not welcomed and what have you. We look, myself look at the Jewish people as most of the original Jewish people who came prior to 1936 were really Arab people of the Jewish religion, no different than the Arab people of the Christian religion. Now, I also have to admit something, that the people who came in from Europe, they came in out of necessity of their own. We have to understand their feeling, why they wanted to have a place where they can feel comfortable being a Jew, because they were persecuted in Europe. We, the Muslim people, never persecuted the Jewish people, and they know that. Their zenith time was when they lived with Islam and so on, because Islam never treated these people as different from the rest of the humanity. The Quran accepts Judaism and Christianity as the people of God. Now, I want to take a little bit of time in here and say, well, who are the Palestinians? Because I have limited time in there. Where did they come from? Did we come from Saudi Arabia? No. Most of the villages in Palestine, you will find that there are 4 different clans. One clan, they call them al-Masriyin, the people who came from Egypt, around at time of Muhammad Ali Pasha, when he invaded that area with the Ottomans. Some Egyptians came in with the army, and then they settled. Now, the rest of the people, another area is called Al-Batanja. Now, these people were the original Palestinian, and most traces, they were Jewish people prior to converting to Islam. And there's another 2 tribes, the Al-Awamri and Al-Hawamda. These are all the original Palestinian people who most likely were Jews. And they converted to Islam when Islam came about. So really, the fact that these people who are the Palestinians, they became Muslim, and they have much more tolerance for religions, for the different religions, than what we have in the United States, believe it or not. I mean, we accept Christianity as Muslims. We accept Judaism as Muslims. And we live together. I can tell you an example where I went to a school, a boarding school, for 2 years. And among us were Christians and Muslim people. I did not know who is Christian and who is a Muslim, and I really didn't care. We lived together, but we never really made any issue of it. The problem that manifested itself after 1948 is because really not the original Jewish people who were in Palestine, it's mainly the influx of the people who came in from Europe. These people were persecuted and they wanted a place to call it, to be safe within it. I understand their feeling, but also we must understand the feeling of the Palestinians who got displaced. They wanted to live in their land. These people have been there. They were Jews, they were Christians, and I mean, who's Christ but a Jew? And who's his mother? She was Jewish. The Christians, approximately 10% of the Palestinians, are originally Jewish people who became converted. And the rest of the people, they must have been Jews or Christians who converted when Islam came about. The fact that these Palestinians, because they are not Jews, it does not take the right of their being in that country. Now, I asked some of my Jewish colleagues who have been dialoguing with them, they say, well, what is the solution? I think the solution will be implemented by its own. Frankly, I think America, sometimes their policies do affect the thing, but the solution to the problem is going to be from within the people themselves in Palestine, in the Middle East, and so on. Ultimately, Palestine or Israel, or call it whatever it is, it's going to be for the people who live in it. And as long as the people look at each other as equal with rights and so on, without discrimination and without partitioning and so on, I think the solution is going to happen within our generation, maybe not in my generation, but will be the new generation. So really the acceptance of one to each other, sooner or later, Israel will be, yes, you want to call it Israel, it will be part of a whole community. It cannot, Israel as a military establishment cannot continue to exist in the Middle East the way they are. Yes, they lived 60 some odd years, but I asked some of my Jews, what's going to happen 100 years from today? Give me, what do you think is going to happen in the Middle East? What's happening in the Middle East now with the convulsion of the young people against their own autocratic governments? This is a good sign. This is a good, healthy sign which I see. And I think it is time for the Israelis or the people who are in control to start realizing that they cannot live on their own as Jews, exclusively Jewish people. They have to be part of the system. They have to be integrated within the Muslim and the Christian community. Yes, they have their own communities, and they want to make their own laws to suit their own kosher diets or what have you, but still they have to live within the Middle East. They cannot constantly be relying on the charity of the Jewish people from overseas, from America, from Europe. They have to do it themselves. The original Jews who came into Palestine were the people who really did it on their own, without any help from the outside. There were schools, there were educators, there were doctors, and so on, and they lived with us and we lived with them. But when the other European influx came in and they says we wanted to have a state to be exclusively Jewish, that's when the problem came about. So all I can say is in due time, things are going to happen for the best, because the younger generation, whether they're Muslim, Christian, or Jews, will realize that they have to live together and be part of the community rather than to alienate people. The one thing that the Palestinians complain about is being treated inhumanely. Now, I never witnessed that at that time in 1948, but I went with a group of rabbis and ministers and so on as part of the dialogue. And then one good Jewish friend, he said, what are you complaining about? What's wrong with it? Why are you complaining about Palestine? I says, okay, we're going to land into Tel Aviv. I want you to notice what's going to happen to me. So all these people, about 21 of us, went through with the passports and so on. And all these American-born individuals, they were Jewish, no problem, just welcome, welcome. Came my turn, and another fellow who was a Muslim, he was actually from Pakistan. They took our passport to one side. I noticed, it says, notice this. They took us to one side, and of course, the rest of the group would not leave us. We actually stayed for about almost 2 hours. They were trying to interrogate me and Ashraf about why are you here. I said, look, your embassy, the American embassy is waiting for us, and so on and so forth. We came in as part of a delegation. But still, because I was originally Palestinian, I was treated completely different than a non-Israeli. Of course, these people have dual citizenship, but they were born in America and so on. So after we finished, I said, you see, I understand how the Palestinian feels. Now, I was not mistreated other than just, my emotions played with me. I was not beaten, I was not jailed, and so on and so forth. But that spiritual downgrading is very important for the Palestinians. And I think the Israelis have to realize that, and also the American public has to realize that. Now, I think that my 15 minutes is over, so I should stop.
Thank you very much. And we appreciate your attention to the timeliness, because we've all been at programs where people were asked to speak for 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, and they spoke much longer than that. So, and there will be time for follow-up with the Q&A as well. So our second speaker is Shah Dalal, who again is someone who's been in the central New York for quite a number of years. He's taught at various universities in the area. He's worked in business, as well as education. He's written. We've got a couple of copies of a book of his that's recently been published. And he's someone who's spoken out in many, many forums about the Israeli-Palestinian situation, as well as broader Middle East issues. So we're delighted that he's able to join us. So please, Shah Dalal.
Thank you very much. As I was driving from New Hartford, where I live, I began to think, what should I say to these folks? I was born in Jerusalem, and the word Nakba, the first time I heard it, actually I heard it in 1947. I was about 12 years old. And we were visiting my grandfather's home in Jerusalem, and my grandfather was sick. He was really dying, and my father and mother took us, and my father brought with him a shortwave radio, and he was so anxious turning the radio on, even though there was a death in the family. He was so anxious to hear what is happening at the United Nations. The date was, actually, I discovered later on, was November 29, 1947. And that's the first time I heard the word Nakba. I heard it from my father. The United Nations partitioned Palestine. In those days, the population of Palestine was about 1,800,000. About 1,300,000 were Palestinian Arabs, Muslims and Christians. About 570,000 were Palestinian Jews. So my father's anxiety and made an exclamation, what a nakba. هذه نكبة فظيعة. This is a horrible disaster. The United Nations divided Palestine into 2 states. One state was supposed to be a Jewish state, and the other state was to be a Palestinian state. But how did they divide it? I just told you that the population of Palestine at that time was 1,800,000, more than 2/3 of whom were Palestinians, and less than 1/3 were Jewish. So the United Nations, in its wisdom, or lack of it, partitioned Palestine, giving to the minority 55% of the area of Palestine, and leaving for the Palestinians 44%. And determining that Jerusalem will be an international entity, 1%, under a trusteeship of the United Nations. The Palestinians in those days possessed and owned close to 93% of the land. As a matter of fact, the partition would have a majority of Palestinians in the proposed Jewish state. Now, put yourself in the shoes of the Palestinians. They were enraged. They were infuriated. They thought this was a grave miscarriage of justice. This is the land on which they lived for generations, for centuries, and they found themselves so angry that they began to say, "Death to all Jews." Now, Ahmed just told you, we lived with Jews like brothers. Actually, my father's accountant was a Jewish gentleman. I called him Ammu Musa, Uncle Musa. His wife and my mother were like sisters. She used to bathe me. And I didn't know the difference. We didn't know the difference. But then there's this anger over this miscarriage of justice, how the country was divided. Then a civil war erupted. Many people don't know that most of the tragedy occurred between November 1947 and May 15, 1948. This is when the Palestinians revolted against the British mandate, and they began to attack Jews everywhere. Ammu Musa and his family disappeared. They went to Tel Aviv. We just didn't know what happened to them. We were worried about them, actually. And so, what the Palestinians didn't know, they had no arms. You heard about the uprising or the rebellion that Ahmed mentioned in 1936. My father was involved in it, actually. And the British mandate crushed it mercilessly, disarmed the Palestinian people. He who was caught with a knife was put in jail. So the Palestinians without arms whatsoever to defend themselves. And they didn't know that this minority of less than 1/3 of the population were armed to the teeth, trained, ready to go. And so the Palestinians revolted, and the Jewish community assaulted the Palestinians and attacked them mercilessly. Most of the expulsions of the Palestinians took place between November 29 and May 15. That is when the inept, stupid, corrupt Arab armies entered, not to crush Israel, not to destroy Israel, but to rescue the Palestinians from the Jewish minority. Historically, any scholar would tell you that these were the origins of the conflict and the origins of the Nakba. 3 days ago, I received a text of a speech delivered by a Mr. Charles Freeman. Anybody knows the name Charles Freeman? Have you ever heard the name? Charles Freeman used to be the Undersecretary of Defense in the Clinton administration. He was appointed by President Obama, to be the Director of Intelligence. And the Jewish lobby revolted mercilessly, and he was forced to withdraw his name. The speech that he gave, which I recommend to all of you to read, I promised the people in charge of this program that I would send them the text of the speech, and maybe they can circulate it. It is worthwhile reading, because very few people, the tragedy of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis revolves around the misinformation and lack of information about what the conflict is all about, how the conflict arose, why the American government is helpless to do anything about it. Freeman, in his speech, analyzes this so eloquently. He gives the whole story. I have been a student of this conflict since I was a young boy. I have not seen anything as truthful, as succinct, as informative as that speech by Charles Freeman. Now, all of you are witnessing what is known as the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, and I'm going to talk about it because of what Ahmed said about the young people. The Arab Spring is a movement by youngsters, most of whom are really 30 or under. They've had enough of despots in the Middle East. Sadly, these feudalistic, corrupt, horrible despots have been nourished and protected and sustained by no other than the greatest democracy of all, ours. If there would be a revolt against the dynasty of Saudi Arabia, you know who would go in and rescue them? And to the credit of Barack Obama, against the advice of some of his closest advisors, he told Hosni Mubarak, your time is up. It's about time to leave. And I respectfully say to you that unless and until the young people of Israel will stand up and tell their leaders, you haven't told us the truth. It's time to change. 4, here in the United States, the influence of our Jewish brothers and sisters in this country on this conflict is immeasurable. Unless the American Jewish community decides we have to reverse course, I can stand here from now until doomsday, tell you about the Nakba, tell you about my family's experience, what happened to us, to my father, to my mother, to my brothers, to my sisters, to the Palestinians, and you will cry to your heart's content, but nothing will change because of the influence of a very organized, very determined group who have a tremendous amount of influence, as Freeman says in his speech, on the domestic as well as the international policies of this country. So how is this going to be attained? I suspect that each and every one of us has to play his role. I have been teaching at Colgate University for the past 7 years. After 9/11, they looked high and low here in Syracuse. I was an adjunct professor at the Maxwell School. I used to teach the Arab-Israeli conflict. I taught Islamic civilization. I taught comparative Middle East governments. They looked high and low. They couldn't find anybody to teach Arabic. So somebody told them, Shah Dalal grew up there. Maybe you ask him, does he speak Arabic? And they asked me. I was afraid to do it at first. Then I did it, and I was glad that I did it. Colgate heard about me, and they invited me 7 years ago to start a program for them. I've been teaching at Colgate both Arabic and Islamic jurisprudence. And it's an education teaching Islamic jurisprudence. Most of my students in Islamic jurisprudence come of the Jewish faith. They are curious about Islam. What does Islam say about Judaism? What does it say about Jesus? What does it say about Moses? It is blasphemous in Islam to speak ill of Judaism. It's blasphemous to speak ill of Christianity. Jesus is revered in Islam as much as he is in Christianity. The only difference is that the Muslims don't believe that he is the Son of God. He is of the Spirit of God. Mary, is mentioned 34 times in the Holy Book of Islam, more so than she is in the Bible. She is revered in Islam. Islam says, he who kills an innocent life kills the whole of humanity. Bin Laden did not represent Islam. Yet, as Professor Freeman says, the suicide bombers, the Osama bin Ladens of the world, have tarnished the name of Arabs and Muslims. And I respectfully also say that the conduct of Israel against the helpless, innocent Palestinians has tarnished the name of the Jewish people. Professor Freeman says Israel is the greatest threat to Judaism and to Jewish people than it is to the Palestinians. Because the world doesn't like injustice. The world doesn't like torture. The world doesn't like inequity. Now, there are 3 or 4 laws in the State of Israel that I'd like you to know about, and I'll conclude. The law of return provides that any Jew in the world has a right to return to Israel. Shodallah, who was born in Jerusalem, I can't return. When I return, I receive the same experience that Ahmad al-Hindi received. I'm a professor, I told him. Yes, please sit down, professor. And I sat down for 2.5 hours before I would allow to go and see my son, who was working for the United Nations. On the other hand, if you are a Jewish person born to a Jewish mother, automatically upon your arrival in Israel, you are given Israeli citizenship. There are 2 laws in Israel. One, they apply to Israelis of Jewish nationality and to Israelis of Arab nationality. If you are an Israeli citizen with Jewish nationality, you have certain rights and privileges that are not available to the Israeli citizens of Arab nationality. There are 1.75 million Palestinians who have Israeli nationality. And the Israeli state does not tell the world the truth about the demography. I just finished telling you, in 1947, when I was 11, 12 years old, the population of Palestine was 1,800,000. Today, the population of the people who live in British Mandate Palestine are close to 15 million. 56% of them are Palestinians. These Palestinians are treated like dirt. How long is this going to last? In South Africa, to the credit of the African-American community, apartheid was discarded. The United States played a minimal role in doing away with apartheid, believe it or not. What exists in Israel today is akin to what exists in South Africa. Don't take my word for it. Do your own research and read about it. You'll find what I'm telling you is very accurate. If you are an Israeli citizen with Jewish nationality, you have certain rights and privileges which are not available to Israeli citizens with Arab nationality. Example, the ownership of the very land which was expropriated from the Palestinians is peculiar only to those Israeli citizens with Jewish nationality. The Palestinians whose land were expropriated may not own land. Israel says that the population of Israel now is 7.25 million. They concede that 1.5 million are Israeli Palestinians. Demographers say they are closer to 1.75 million. In the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, there are another 4 million, maybe 4.5 million Palestinians. So what is the solution? I respectfully say that the two-state solution is phony. It's a farce. It will never work. The solution is a unified state where Palestinians, Christians, and Muslims, Israelis with the Jewish faith, should live together in harmony and peace and equality. As Ahmed says, 100 years from now, this will be the case. Should we have that solution by non-violent means or by a bloodbath? I think it should be by a non-violent means. And I hope that will come to be. It will come to be only, as I said earlier, when the Israeli young people march in Tel Aviv, in Netanya, in Haifa, and ask for equality, not only for themselves, for the Palestinians. And they will. Whoever imagined that millions of Egyptians would march in the streets of Cairo asking for the head of Hosni Mubarak? Whoever imagined that the United States, who was Hosni Mubarak's best friend, said, Hosni, your time is over. And I think that is going to happen sooner or later. Let's hope it will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shah Dalal. Before I introduce our third speaker, I'm going to pass around some baskets. Like all work for peace and social justice, we need funds to maintain the work. So we'd like you to be generous if you're able. If you're not able, feel free to pass the basket along with a clear conscience. If you are able to contribute, we welcome a quarter, $1, $5, a check for $500, whatever you're able to contribute. And some of the money will go to support the work of CNY Working, and some will go to, to compensate the Art Rage Gallery, this lovely space which allows us to use it for many, many events and does great work for social justice here in our community. One other little change of plans. Naja Zaid is here now and is going to share a poem from the wonderful Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. So.
Good evening, and thank you for being here today. Do not make an example of me again. O gentlemen, O prophets, don't ask the trees for their names. Don't ask the valleys who their mother is. From my forehead bursts the sword of light, and from my hand springs the water of the river. All the hearts of the people are my identity. So take away my passport. It does not represent me. Thank you.
So our final speaker is Dana Alwan, who, unlike the previous two, is not from Central New York, but comes to us. She's a postdoctoral fellow at Syracuse University right now and has been so for several months, but she teaches typically at Queens College up in Ontario and has been very active in working for Palestinian rights there, and we're delighted that she's able to join us tonight. Dana.
Okay, I think I'm shorter than both speakers, actually. Thank you both. I feel honored to be following you. So can you hear me? We're good? All right. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. It's raining outside, and I'm really pleased to be here. I've actually only been in Syracuse for 7 days now, so I'm jumping right into this process of talking about Palestine, and today we couldn't have a better day. Rainy, sad, miserable, reflecting the kind of feelings we have today to commemorate the Nakba. So unlike the two speakers, I'm actually going to move this a little bit back, so it feels like it's attacking me. All right. So I think this is good. Unlike the two speakers before me, I don't have the eloquence of going off the cuff, so I'll actually be reading my paper. I hope you can bear with me. All right. It's an honor to be asked to speak to you all in Syracuse on May 15th, a day that bears much memory, pain, and history for Palestinians, both young and old, men and women, the few living in historic Palestine and the many living elsewhere in the diaspora. Without a doubt, May 15th is a profoundly difficult day for Palestinians. For many of us, it's a day in which we remember a place we have never known, a place we have been told about but never visited, seen, or lived in. May 15th is a day in which we mourn the loss of historic Palestine and our human right to live, to prosper, and to grow there. For many, Nakba is the catastrophe that befell the Palestinians for crimes in which they played no role, and for imperial and colonial greed in which they did not participate. And yet, there isn't a singular Nakba that occurred on May 15th, but rather a string of catastrophes, events that occur on a daily basis, that render the conditions of living for Palestinians everywhere ever more precarious, conditional. For us, May 15th is every day a Palestinian man, woman, or child is callously killed or illegally incarcerated. It is also a day, every day, a Palestinian home is demolished, an olive tree uprooted, and yet another village cordoned off by an illegal apartheid wall. It is every day another Palestinian refugee dies and is buried outside his or her home in historic Palestine, away from lands she or he once loved, cared for, and nourished. Nakba is a day in which we mourn our loss of land and people, but it's also a day we celebrate the resilience and steadfastness, or sumud, of the Palestinians living under Israeli occupation and those languishing in the many refugee camps across the Arab world. Nakba is today, yesterday, and every day. But before I can talk with legitimacy about the Palestinian Nakba, a day in which Palestinians the world over commemorate the past and ongoing crimes of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and occupation, perpetrated against them by the Israeli state, I must first start by acknowledging a shared and similar history and reality occurring on this very land on which I have the privilege of speaking today. I therefore begin my talk by acknowledging the Onondaga Nation and its territorial claims to the land on which the city of Syracuse today stands. For centuries, these territorial claims have gone ignored, challenged, ridiculed, and lately defeated by an unjust justice system that privileges the newly acquired rights of settlers, people like you and me, over the rights, ostensibly antiquated rights, of indigenous peoples. A system that operates through methods of obfuscation and legal and social, cultural and economic and racial burial, intimidation, separation, denial, and apartheid. New to Syracuse, I'm ill-equipped to talk about this history with any nuance or depth, but I'm able to recognize from precursory and even elementary level readings the similarity of the techniques used by the settler colonial states of the United States and Israel. I can see, for example, the parallels between the roles played by the state of New York's legislative and governing bodies in illegally acquiring the land of Syracuse and the land theft occurring in historic Palestine that is being sanctioned by the highest legislative bodies in Israel today. I'm able to recognize how shrinking native control of land and the diminished sovereignty of the Onondaga Nation also approximate the diminutive and sometimes even tokenistic roles relegated to Palestinian governing bodies in Israel. As people committed to justice and the principles of equity and peace, these similarities must be witnessed, recognized, and acknowledged, because as we come together today to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people, a people many of us will never meet, from a land from which only some of us will have the right to visit, we must ask ourselves how and in what ways do we recognize the histories of native oppression, colonization, and genocide in which we are undeniably implicated, both as citizens, immigrants, settlers, and even visitors in the United States of America. How do we stand in solidarity with the indigenous peoples on whose lands we live and prosper on today? And what might we make of our willingness to recognize past and ongoing oppression and colonization over there, but not see, question, and critique past and ongoing oppression and colonization over here right now? If Nakba Day is a day in which Palestinians the world over ask allies to stand in solidarity with their righteous struggle, then it is also a day in which Palestinians, people like me, must stand in solidarity with the equally righteous and even more prolonged struggles of indigenous peoples in North America and elsewhere. This talk, then, is dedicated to my Native brothers and sisters in the hopes of building bridges of alliance I get so nervous at these things. Okay, so this talk then. Are you, my friends? I'm not sure. Okay. I don't know you. I've only been here 7 days, so there. I don't trust very quickly. Okay, so this talk then is dedicated to my Native brothers and sisters in the hopes of building bridges of alliance and solidarity across ethnic, racial, religious, geographic, and historical lines. So I start there. I start by acknowledging the Onondaga Nation and other Native brothers and sisters. To speak of the Palestinian Nakba is to invoke the memory of Syracuse, of a series of meticulously planned and carefully executed events that have led to the creation of one of the world's largest and oldest refugee problems. It is to remind ourselves and others of the destruction of over 400 villages and thriving Palestinian communities, and to bring to international memory the process of ethnic cleansing. There we go. All right. Actually, this is better. Okay. That thing was attacking me. All right. It is also to remind ourselves and others of the destruction of over 400 thriving Palestinian villages and communities, and to bring to international memory the process of ethnic cleansing that led to the expulsion and forcible removal of at least 750,000 Palestinians on the eve of Israel's quote-unquote Independence Day. Writing on the calamities that befell the Palestinians in 1948, Israeli historian Alwan reminds readers of the importance of reconceptualizing the Nakba. He writes, "The figure of the 750,000 uprooted Palestinians can seem to be modest, quote unquote, when set in the context of the transfer of millions of people around the world." Think of the transatlantic slave trade, for example. Pape urges us to relativize numbers and to think instead in percentages, and to begin to understand the magnitude of the tragedy that befell the Palestinians. Half of the indigenous people living in Palestine were driven out, half of their villages and towns were destroyed, and only very few among them ever managed to return. So remember that, half of the people of Palestine were driven out. Imagine for a moment then, if half of the members of your communities were one day to disappear. Imagine if the so-called disappearance was both forced and violent, and that your fellow neighbors' hopes of returnings would prove ever more futile on a day-to-day basis. Imagine, if you will, that this disappearance was not only barely registered in history books, major dailies, and official record, but is vehemently sanitized, denied, and erased from collective and world memory. Imagine, also, that those people forcibly removed from your communities were not simply foreign others you could not understand, but people with lives, dreams, and aspirations, people like me and you. While the magnitude of the Nakba can certainly be understood in numbers, what is perhaps more important today is the recognition of the Nakba not simply as a past event, but an ongoing one. It is important, author and academic Joseph Masad reminds us, in a 2008 article marking the Nakba's 60th anniversary, to resist the push to inscribe the Nakba as a finished event, a closed chapter in contemporary human history. He urges us instead to historicize the Nakba, to consciously extend its memory, to read it not as an endpoint of Israeli state aggression and violence towards the Palestinians, but as an ongoing, continuing, and aggravated assault on Palestinian culture, life, and ways of being. So he writes, the Nakba is in fact much older than 60 years, and it is still with us, pulsating with life and coursing through history by piling up more calamities upon the Palestinian people. I hold that the Nakba is a historical epoch, that is 127 years old and is ongoing. The year 1881 is the date when Jewish colonization of Palestine started, and as everyone knows, it has never ended. Can I get water? Thank you. Thank you. Much as the world would like to present Palestinians as living in a post-Nakba period, I insist that we live thoroughly in Nakba times. What we are doing this year is not an act of commemorating, but an act of witnessing the ongoing Nakba that continues to destroy, thank you, Farha, Palestine and the Palestinians. I submit, therefore, that this year is not the 60th anniversary of the Nakba at all, but rather one more year of enduring its brutality, that the history of the Nakba has never been a history of the past, but decidedly a history of the present. What does it mean to consciously see the Nakba as a present? What does it mean to consider the Palestinians as the subjects of an ongoing Nakba? How do we use this recognition to connect the Nakba to other tragedies, calamities, and evil committed against indigenous peoples in Palestine and elsewhere? In asking these questions, I'm not interested in reinscribing a status of special or singular victimhood upon the Palestinians. That the Palestinians have been the victims of the Zionist project is unquestionable. That is a fact not in need of proof or further demonstration from Palestinians or their good-willing allies and friends, people like you and me. That they continue to be the victims of the Zionist project, repackaged and resold as a movement committed to finding a state that lives in peace with quote-unquote its Arab neighbors, remains a more difficult truth to accept. While many of us concede that the Palestinians suffered in 48, very few of us remain committed to connecting this suffering to the events taking place in Palestine today. There's a car problem, people. We remain unwilling, for example, to see that a state founded on the principles of expulsion, inequity, and racial difference and superiority cannot work with competing discourses of Palestinian victimhood and righteousness. We refuse to see the telltale signs of a nation bent on the destruction of the other in times of war, but also, more significantly, in times of so-called peace and peacemaking. Explaining his reasons for blowing the whistle on the farcical peace process in which the Palestinian Authority participated on behalf of the Palestinian people, bartering and negotiating our right to resistance, former peace negotiator Ziad Klott wrote, "The peace negotiations were a deceptive farce, whereby biased terms were unilaterally imposed by Israel and systematically endorsed by the US and EU capitals. Far from enabling a negotiated fair end of the conflict, the pursuit of the Oslo process has deepened Israeli segregationist policies and justified the tightening of the security control imposed on the Palestinian population, as well as its geographical fragmentation. Far from preserving the land on which to build a state, so-called Palestinian state, it has tolerated the intensification of the colonization of the Palestinian territory. Far from maintaining a national cohesion, the process I participated in, that wasn't me, that was Ziad Klott, albeit briefly, proved to be instrumental in creating and aggravating divisions among the Palestinians. In its most recent developments, it has become a cruel enterprise from which the Palestinians of Gaza have suffered the most. Last but not least, these negotiations excluded, for the most part, the great majority of the Palestinians, the 7 million Palestinian refugees. Known as the Palestine Papers, these documents have revealed the unwillingness of the Israeli negotiators to offer even measly concessions to their Palestinian counterparts. They show how, defeated and humiliated, the Palestinian Authority negotiated away the rights of 7 million Palestinians in order to push for a false and precarious peace. They reveal that the Oslo Peace Accord can now safely be registered in Palestinian history as yet another Nakba, another aggression and violation of Palestinian human rights. The Nakba is not a singular event, Palestinians remind us. This fact is worth bearing in mind and repeating constantly. Only last week, for example, Israeli journalist Akiva Eldar unearthed yet another Nakba committed against the Palestinians. He discovered that between the period of 1967 and 1994, Israel implemented a policy of quote-unquote discreetly canceling the residency permits of over 140,000 Palestinians from the West Bank. The news, shocking for some, was not new to many of us whose families and friends were the subjects of these discriminatory policies of ethnic cleansing. But what does this news even matter? Why should we be concerned that this evidence has come to the surface? It matters because the 140,000 Palestinians or cancellations happened to Palestinians living in the West Bank, territory that Israel's claim to have ceded authority over to the Palestinians. It matters because these cancellations continued in a post-Oslo period, a period when Israel and the world pushed for the establishment of a Palestinian state within the boundaries of the West Bank and Gaza. The news matters because these cancellations represent an intentional continuation of a process of ethnic cleansing, rather than a break with an underlying principles of demographic fear and loathing guiding Israeli treatment of Palestinians. When a state that not only claims that it's not an occupying force, but represents itself as a peace-loving, respectful, democratic member of the national community, just like the US, of course, discreetly and slowly empties out an aspiring nation state from its rightful inhabitants over and over again, we must pause and wonder what narratives, policies, and procedures enable such grave human rights assaults and transgressions. In an article published in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, Gideon Levy puts a human face on the recent revelation, writing, "The cry of the dispossessed has now been translated into numbers. 140,000 only until the Oslo Accords. Students who went to study at foreign universities, businessmen who tried their luck abroad, scientists who went abroad for professional training, native Jerusalemites who dared to move to the West Bank temporarily. They all met the same fate. All of them were taken by the wind and expelled by Israel. They could not return." To bear witness to these painful facts in the Palestinian past and present is certainly an important and worthwhile endeavor. But to pretend that the Nakba is a historical past, a sealed and completed event, a sad but necessary chapter in the creation of the State of Israel, as some Israeli new historians have told us, is both morally deluded and ethically irresponsible. It is a deceptive violation of reality and truth. As Levy told us, while we are still desperately concealing, he's talking about Israeli society, while we are still desperately concealing, denying, and repressing our major ethnic cleansing of 1948, over 600,000 refugees, some who fled for fear of the Israeli Defense Forces and its predecessors, some who were expelled by force, it turns out that 1948 never ended, that its spirit is still with us. But it's not simply the spirit of 1948 that lives with us, but rather its strategies, policies, and methods of ethnic cleansing that mark the reality of life for Palestinians in Palestine and the diaspora. It's not just a spirit, it's actually a policy. My friend Arish Jafari, a Palestinian activist I met on my last visit to my homeland, an attempt to claim my birthright to Palestine, posted an interesting update on her Facebook status today. She writes, "I'm flipping sick of the Nakba. I do not want to be a refugee anymore." Arij is one of the quote-unquote internally displaced Palestinians who spent a large chunk of her life in a refugee camp in Bethlehem. On my visit to Palestine, Arij took me through around the city of Bethlehem, patiently answering some of my dumb questions about her life, her family, and her history, and thus revealing something about my own. She did not choose to be a refugee. She simply is one by virtue of her Palestinianness. The internet is abuzz with stories of Palestinians today, contemplating what Nakba means for us and our people. Another friend posted the following: "On Nakba Day, I do recognize Israel. I recognize it as an apartheid state, one of the few lasting occupations in recent history, a state that discriminates against its own citizens, a state that is in violation of international law, 65 UN resolutions, basic human rights, and a state that has been oppressing the Palestinian people for decades. So here we go. There's my recognition of the State of Israel." A former student of mine, Mais Abdelaziz, another Palestinian refugee who was born and raised in Kuwait and has never known Palestine, writes, 63 years, and there's no logical reason to why we continue to remember, maybe because we have no other choice, maybe because it is shoved in our faces every single day. The stories remain as facts, shaping us and defining who and what we are. I cite these reflections not in an effort to enter what Andrea Smith labels as an oppression Olympics, but I repeat them with the desire to push forth the idea and the fact that the Palestinian struggle is a just one. It's a just one, it's a continuing one. That it need not be accompanied by constant affirmations of Israel's right to exist, or a repeated disavowal of the right to resist occupation and oppression. As I speak today, Israeli occupation forces, alternatively known as the IDF, have opened fire on protesters, Palestinian refugees, and Arab brothers and sisters who dared to break Israel's siege of the Palestinians, to interrupt its deliberate attempts to eradicate our past memories and current presence. Several people have been killed and scores of others wounded in the Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, Ras Maroun in Lebanon, and the Israeli occupied West Bank, as Palestinians marked the Nakba, reported Al Jazeera shortly before I attended this event. More deaths will be recorded, of that I am sure. We heard from Mazen earlier today. Described as quote-unquote infiltrators by the liberal Israeli press, how will their deaths, their willingness to risk all for themselves and others be registered in the history of the Palestinian Nakba? How will we remember their sacrifices and their desire to interrupt historical amnesia, complacency, and forgetfulness? By acknowledging that the Nakba is here and now, by remembering that the series of calamities that befell the Palestinians were not the result of a natural disaster, but part and parcel of a planned and executed strategy of state formation and control, by recognizing the inalienable rights of Palestinians to live with dignity and respect, by refusing the logic of symmetry and push for compromise at the expense of the Palestinian people, by rejecting vacuous concepts of peace and Palestinian nation building, by standing up against settler colonialism over there in Palestine and over here all around us, occurring right now, by joining the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, and finally, by remembering that the Nakba is not over because the Palestinians, people like me, refuse to forget, move on, disavow, or disremember. Thank you.